What would you do if you pulled over on a frozen Alaskan road and found two children who weren't quite human, shivering, abandoned, and calling you family within days? The road outside Anchorage in January isn't a place most people linger. It's the kind of cold that eats through your jacket, slides under your skin, and settles deep in your bones. On that night, the snow was piling so fast that the highway lines were little more than ghosts under the headlights. Colin Haverford gripped the wheel of his old Ford pickup, wipers struggling against the storm, and thought about how the silence of these nights could either calm you or break you. He'd worked a 12-hour shift rewiring a generator for a construction crew, and all he wanted was to get home to his cabin, heat up leftover stew, and forget the day. But then his lights caught something. Not an animal, not debris. Two shapes, small, unmoving, curled together at the edge of the road. His heart kicked hard, his first thought being, kids. Kids left out here would freeze before morning. Colin slowed hard, tires sliding a little on the ice as he pulled to the shoulder. He left the engine running, headlights cutting across the swirling snow, and stepped out into air so sharp it stung his throat. "Hello?" he called, crunching toward them. No answer. The closer he got, the stranger it seemed. Their clothes didn't look like winter gear. Thin, almost metallic fabric, silver blue against the snow. They were trembling, holding on to each other like their lives depended on it. He crouched down. "You two okay? Can you hear me?" One of them, the taller, lifted her head. Her eyes caught the light in a way that made Colin pause. Too bright, too reflective, like the shine of water under a full moon. She whispered something he couldn't understand. Her voice high, melodic, carrying a rhythm that sounded almost like a song. The smaller one tugged on her sleeve, then looked up at him with the same impossible eyes. "Please," she said, the word broken but clear enough. "Cold." That was all Colin needed. He stripped off his heavy coat and draped it around them both, ignoring the sting of wind on his own arms. "Come on, I've got a truck." Heat. The taller one hesitated, as if uncertain whether to trust him, but the smaller one leaned into his chest when he offered his hand. Their skin was cool, far too cool for anyone still alive out here. He scooped them up one after the other and carried them to the truck. Inside, the heater blasted weak warmth, but it was better than the storm. The two huddled together on the passenger seat, shivering under his coat. Colin glanced at them between shifts of the gear, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Their faces looked human enough, young, fragile, but their skin shimmered faintly, like it had caught the light and refused to let it go. "Names?" he asked, more out of instinct than expectation. The taller one stared at him, lips moving, but only strange syllables came out. Then she pressed her hand to her chest. "Serenia," she said slowly, forcing the sounds. She nudged the smaller one, who copied her gesture. "Merilith," the girl whispered. Colin repeated them under his breath, nodding as if that would help him process what had just happened. He didn't ask where they came from, not yet. The storm was bad, and he had to keep his focus on the road. But his gut twisted as he thought about how they ended up out there. No jackets, no boots, clothes that looked thinner than a sheet. If he hadn't passed by, they would have been bodies in the snow by sunrise. "Okay, Serenia." "Merilith," he said, as if speaking their names would make them feel safer. "You're going to be all right now. I'll get you warm, I'll get you fed. Just hang in there." They didn't answer, not with words, but Merilith reached for his sleeve, holding it with trembling fingers as though anchoring herself to him. Serenia's gaze stayed fixed on him, cautious yet desperate, like she wanted to believe but couldn't fully let herself. Colin tightened his grip on the wheel. He didn't know who they were. He didn't know what they were. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever had left them out here in the freezing dark, he couldn't let it happen again. But he had no idea that by pulling over on that road, he'd stepped into something far larger than a simple rescue. The drive back to Colin's cabin felt twice as long as usual. The storm thickened, winds pushing against the truck like invisible hands, and every mile demanded his full attention. But his eyes kept sliding to the two girls pressed together in the seat beside him. Serenia sat rigid, shoulders drawn up, scanning the windshield as if expecting something to leap out of the dark. Merilith, though smaller, leaned against her, shivering under Colin's coat. "You're safe," he said, not sure if they fully understood. "I've got a place just a few miles out. Heat, food, beds. We'll get you warm." Serenia tilted her head, lips parting as though she was trying to shape words, but what came out was more sound than language. A string of tones, rising and falling, sharp on some syllables, soft on others. She repeated it, slower this time, as if urging him to listen. Colin kept one hand on the wheel. I don't understand you." He tapped his chest lightly. "Colin, my name." Colin Serenia's brow furrowed. She echoed the sound awkwardly. "Colin?" and then pointed at him. "Close enough," he said with a faint laugh, surprised at the flicker of relief that came with hearing her try. Merilith, quiet until now, whispered something to her sister, then tried to mimic him too. "Colin!" Her voice trembled, but her eyes met his, hopeful, like she wanted his approval. "That's it," Colin encouraged. "Yeah, Colin." The heater rattled in the dash, struggling, but the cab was finally warm enough that their shivers slowed. He noticed their hands, longer fingers than his, tipped with faintly silver nails. Not painted. Natural. He forced himself to keep driving, mind racing with questions he wasn't ready to ask. When his cabin came into view, a squat, weathered place surrounded by pine and half buried in snow, he exhaled in relief. Pulling into the drive, he killed the engine. "All right, we're here," he said, reaching across to push the door open for them. Merilith hesitated, clutching his sleeve again. Serenia's eyes scanned the shadows outside like she was gauging danger. He softened his voice. "It's okay. No one here but me." They exchanged a look. Serenia whispered something quick and hushed, then helped Merilith slide out of the truck. Colin hurried ahead, unlocking the door and flipping the switch for the porch light. A dim glow cut across the snow. Inside, the air was cold from the long day, but it was shelter. Colin guided them to the couch, grabbed wood from the stack by the stove, and coaxed a fire to life. Soon flames flickered, throwing warmth into the room. "Sit, warm up," he said, gesturing. The girls sat close together, eyes fixed on the fire as though they'd never seen anything like it. Serenia reached out slowly, hand hovering near the flame's heat, then drew it back with a startled laugh that sounded half curious, half frightened. Colin brought blankets from the hall closet and draped them over their shoulders. He didn't miss the way Merilith burrowed instantly, letting the fabric swallow her, while Serenia kept watchful, alert, though her body eased fractionally. "You hungry?" he asked. He set a can of soup on the counter, popping it open and pouring it into a pot. The smell of chicken and vegetables soon filled the air. When he handed them each a steaming bowl, Serenia eyed it like a puzzle. She touched the edge, sniffed it, then glanced at him. "Food," he explained, spooning some into his own mouth to show them. Merilith copied him first, sipping carefully. Her eyes widened, then she shoveled another spoonful. Serenia followed more cautiously, but the look of relief on her face was unmistakable. Colin sat back in his chair, watching them eat like they hadn't seen a proper meal in days. Questions pressed at him. Who they were, where they came from, how they ended up half dead in the snow. But he bit them back. They needed rest before answers. After dinner, he pulled out an extra quilt and laid it across the couch. "You two can sleep here tonight. It's warm." "Safe?" Merilith murmured something to Serenia, her voice soft as a lullaby. Serenia looked at Colin again, meeting his gaze directly. She didn't smile, not quite, but her expression shifted, gratitude mixed with something harder to name. Colin extinguished the lamp, leaving only the fire's glow. He lay in his own bed down the hall, staring at the ceiling long after his eyes should have closed. He'd thought he was just helping strangers, maybe hikers who'd lost their way. But their names, their voices, their very presence told him otherwise. But it wasn't just the mystery of who they were that kept him awake. It was the certainty that their arrival meant his life would never be the same. Colin woke to the sound of movement in the living room. For a moment he thought it was the storm rattling the old walls, but then he heard it again, soft footsteps against the wooden floorboards. He sat up, pulled on a flannel shirt, and stepped quietly into the hallway. The fire he'd left smoldering had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint orange light across the room. Serenia stood near the stove, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, gazing at the flickering coals as if studying something sacred. Merilith was still curled on the couch, but her eyes tracked Colin the second he entered. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked softly, careful not to startle them. Serenia turned, startled anyway, before recovering. Her lips parted and she tried, "Cold. Better." Her accent bent the word, but it was there. Colin managed a small smile. "Yeah, warmer now." He knelt by the stove, tossing another log onto the embers. Sparks leapt and the flames roared back to life. Serenia flinched at the sudden flare, but leaned closer, fascinated. Merilith whispered something to her sister, a string of quick syllables that sounded like flowing water. Serenia answered back in the same strange tongue, her tone firm but gentle. Colin couldn't catch a word, but he recognized the dynamic. Older sibling, protective, guiding, he pointed toward the kettle. "Tea, want some?" They both watched as he filled it with water and set it on the stove. When it whistled, Merilith startled, shrinking deeper into her blanket until Serenia touched her hand, soothing her with more musical words. Colin poured 2 mugs, sliding one toward each of them. Careful. Hot. He blew across the surface to demonstrate. Merilith copied him, eyes wide, then sipped. The way she lit up after the first taste, you'd think she'd never had something so simple before. Serenia, though slower to try, finally did. She closed her eyes after swallowing, holding the mug close to her chest like it was something precious. Colin leaned against the counter, watching them. He couldn't ignore the details anymore. The shimmer in their skin wasn't just light from the fire. It was faint, like the trace of stars beneath the surface. And their eyes, reflective even in dimness, carried no whites, only deep pools of shifting color. "Where'd you come from?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. They didn't answer. Serenia's gaze met his, searching, but no words came. Merilith shifted under her blanket, eyes dropping to the floor. Colin sighed. "Okay, tomorrow. We'll figure it out tomorrow." They stayed like that for a while, 3 strangers bound together by firelight and silence. Then Merilith did something unexpected. She set her mug down, slid off the couch, and crossed the room toward him. Her steps were tentative, like she was afraid he'd push her away. When she reached him, she tugged gently at his sleeve again, the same way she had in the truck. "Colin," she whispered, voice fragile but certain. He swallowed hard. "Yeah." Colin Serenia stood too, watching closely, her protective instincts sharp. But when Merilith leaned against his side, she didn't intervene. She only stepped closer, placing her hand briefly on his arm as if testing boundaries. That small contact carried more weight than words ever could. They were still terrified, still lost, but in that moment, they were telling him something he understood perfectly. They trusted him. He let out a long breath and gently guided them back to the couch. "All right, get some rest. Big day tomorrow." They curled together again under the quilt, whispering in their language until their voices faded. Colin lingered in the doorway, watching their fragile shapes outlined by the fire. He thought about the neighbors, about people in town who would never look at these girls and see what he saw. They'd see threats, oddities, reasons to call the authorities. But Colin wasn't about to let that happen. When he finally returned to his bed, the storm outside had quieted, leaving only the occasional groan of ice shifting on the roof. His eyes stayed open long past midnight. He didn't know why fate had dropped these two into his life. But he knew one thing: whatever came next, He couldn't let them go back out into that cold world alone. But by morning, the first cracks in their fragile peace would already start to show. Morning came gray and heavy, the kind of light that made everything look flat against the snow. Colin brewed coffee in the kitchen, the smell carrying into the living room where Serenia and Merilith stirred beneath the quilt. He'd half expected them to vanish in the night, the way stray dogs sometimes disappeared after you offered food, but there they were, still wrapped together like they feared separation more than anything else. "Morning," Colin said, voice steady, though his chest felt oddly tight. "You two sleep okay?" Merilith sat up slowly, hair falling across her face, and gave him a small nod. Serenia, on the other hand, watched him with the same cautious sharpness she had last night. He slid 2 mugs of steaming cocoa across the table. "Try this." Sweet. Warm Serenia lifted hers first, sniffed it, then took a tentative sip. Her brow shot up, and for the first time, Colin saw the faintest ghost of a smile curve her mouth. Merilith mirrored her sister, giggled softly at the taste, and tugged at Colin's sleeve as if demanding his approval again. "Good, huh?" he said, grinning despite himself. They spent most of the morning in a strange dance of trial and error. Colin pointed at objects around the room, chair, window, fire, and repeated the words slowly. Serenia watched intently, lips moving silently before she tried the sounds herself. "Ch-air," she said haltingly, her accent bending the syllables but landing close enough. "Exactly," Colin encouraged. "Chair." Merilith tried too, laughing when her version came out garbled. Serenia corrected her with the same patient tone Colin had noticed the night before, guiding her gently. It hit him then that these two weren't just lost. They were learning to build a bridge into his world, one word at a time. By midday, they could piece together simple phrases. When Colin pointed at himself and repeated, "Colin," Serenia tapped her chest. "Serenia." Then she tapped her sister. "Merilith." She pointed back at him, repeating his name clearer now. The exchange grew into halting dialogue. "Food?" Merilith asked, her voice shaky but proud of the attempt. Colin chuckled, pulling bread from the pantry. "Yeah, food. We'll make sandwiches." While they ate, Colin tried again. "Where from?" He gestured broadly toward the window, then back at them. Serenia froze, sandwich halfway to her mouth. She and Merilith exchanged a quick string of their strange language, voices clipped, urgent. Merilith's eyes dropped to the table. Serenia's jaw tightened before she finally muttered, "Far." "Far where?" Colin pressed gently. Serenia met his gaze. "Not here." The words were enough to raise goosebumps across his arms. Not here, not Alaska, maybe not even Earth. He didn't push further. He could see how much effort it took her just to say that. That afternoon, Colin brought out some old flannel shirts and sweatpants. They were oversized but warmer than the thin silver fabric they wore. Serenia resisted at first, touching the clothes like they were foreign objects. Merilith slipped into them quickly, laughing at the baggy sleeves, spinning in circles like it was a costume. Colin caught himself laughing with her, then noticed Serenia watching, her expression softening. She finally pulled the shirt over her head, mumbling something that sounded suspiciously like "thank you." By evening, the cabin felt different, less like a shelter, more like the beginning of a household. Merilith asked for words constantly, pointing at spoons, cups, doors, repeating each until she got them right. Serenia spoke less, but when she did, her words came sharper, clearer. As night closed in, Colin stoked the fire again. He should have felt relief that they were alive, that he'd done the right thing, but unease gnawed at him. He hadn't forgotten the way Serenia's eyes darted toward the woods when he asked about their origin, or the way Merilith's voice dropped when she whispered in their strange tongue. And then, just as he was setting plates aside, headlights swept across the front window. A car slowed on the road, its tires crunching over ice. Colin's chest tightened. Nobody usually came down this way without reason. The vehicle lingered a moment, engine idling, before rolling on. The glow disappeared into the storm. Serenia stood by the window, shoulders tense, staring after it long after it was gone. She whispered something to Merilith, who grabbed her hand and held it tight. Colin forced his voice steady. Just a car. Nothing to worry about. But he wasn't sure if he believed it himself, because out here people noticed everything, and soon someone would start asking questions. The snow had stopped by morning, leaving the world wrapped in silence. Colin shoveled a path from the porch to the truck, his breath fogging in the frigid air. Through the cabin window, he caught glimpses of Serenia and Merilith. Merilith pressed her hands to the glass, fogging it up and drawing clumsy shapes. Serenia stood behind her, watchful, scanning the tree line as though the forest itself might turn hostile. Inside, the warmth felt different now, less like his cabin and more like theirs. Merilith trailed him as he moved around the kitchen, repeating words after him with boundless curiosity. "Knife," she said, clumsy but proud when he pointed at the one in his hand. "Plate." She mispronounced it, and Colin corrected her gently. She giggled and tried again. Serenia, meanwhile, studied him. She was less eager to mimic but sharper in comprehension. When Colin showed Merilith how to butter toast, Serenia repeated the phrase under her breath, the sounds clearer than before. It unsettled him a little how quickly they were adapting, but at the same time, it impressed him. "Fast learners," he said, half to himself. "Fast learners," Serenia echoed, testing the phrase. Colin froze, spoon in midair. She gave a small shrug, as if it was no big deal. He let out a low laugh. "Yeah, you've got that right." By midday, the three of them sat at the table sharing soup and bread. Merilith leaned against his arm, head bobbing as she tried to keep up with the conversation. Serenia's tone was firmer, coaxing her to speak slowly and carefully. Their bond was unshakable. It reminded Colin of when his younger sister used to trail him everywhere before life had pulled them apart. But outside these walls, life wasn't so forgiving. Later that afternoon, Colin walked to the mailbox at the end of the drive. His neighbor, Paul Strickland, happened to be trudging down the road with his dog. Paul was the type who noticed everything, especially when there wasn't much else to occupy his time. "Morning, Haverford," Paul called, tugging his hat lower. "Saw your truck out late the other night. Roads were near impassable. What were you doing out?" Colin forced a casual tone. "Just heading home from work." Long shift. Paul gave him a long look. "Saw lights at your place yesterday." "More than usual. You've got company?" "Family stopping by," Colin lied quickly, pulse ticking in his throat. "Cousins from out of state." Paul didn't challenge him outright, but the doubt was plain in his eyes. He muttered something to his dog and kept walking, though Colin could feel his gaze even after he'd passed. Back inside, Colin dropped the mail on the counter and tried to mask his unease. Merilith darted over, tugging at his sleeve. "Outside?" she asked, pointing to the door. "Not today," Colin said quickly. "Too cold." Her face fell, but Serenia touched her shoulder, murmuring something gentle in their own tongue. Colin caught the protective tone again, the way Serenia shielded her younger sister not just from the weather, but from the world itself. That night, after dinner, they all sat by the fire. Merilith tried to braid the fringe of the blanket while humming softly. Serenia, more serious, asked Colin questions in broken English. "Why, people look here?" He hesitated. "Small town. Folks notice when something's different." Serenia's gaze sharpened. "Different? Bad?" Colin's throat tightened. "Different makes people curious. Sometimes scared, but not bad. Not if they take the time to understand." She weighed his words in silence before finally nodding, though her expression said she wasn't convinced. Merilith, oblivious to the weight of the conversation, leaned her head against Colin's shoulder. He froze for a beat, then relaxed, letting her stay there. Serenia noticed but didn't stop her. Instead, she watched him, measuring his reaction. It hit him in that quiet moment. They weren't just grateful for his help. They wanted more. They wanted belonging. They wanted family. And maybe deep down, so did he. But belonging came at a price. and soon the whispers outside his cabin would grow too loud to ignore. The next day, Colin loaded his toolbox into the truck for a job in town. He hesitated at the cabin door, staring back at Serenia and Merilith, sitting on the couch. Merilith fiddled with the worn TV remote, fascinated by the buttons, while Serenia kept her arms crossed, watching him with a sharpness that seemed older than her years. "I'll be back before dark," he told them. "Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone." Serenia tilted her head, repeating slowly, "No, door. Wait. Colin, exactly." He gave a reassuring smile and left, though his stomach knotted as he drove away. Anchorage wasn't far, but it felt like another world compared to the isolation of his cabin. At the hardware store, he overheard Paul Strickland's voice before he even turned the aisle. "Lights on at his place, I'm telling you," Paul was saying to the clerk. "Saw figures through the window, didn't look like family to me." Colin froze, gripping the wrench in his hand. The clerk shrugged. "Maybe he's just got company, Paul." "It's not your business." "Not my business until something happens," Paul muttered. "You know how things get around here. Outsiders bring trouble." Colin stepped around the corner deliberately, forcing a friendly tone. "Morning, Paul." "You talking about me?" Paul's eyes narrowed, but he plastered on a thin smile. "Just saying, haven't seen you this sociable in years." "Who've you got staying with you?" "Like I said, family," Colin replied evenly. "They're visiting for a while." Nothing to fuss about, Paul studied him as though weighing whether to push further. Finally, he muttered, "All right, Haverford. Just don't bring headaches down on the rest of us." He left with his dog tugging at the leash. Colin exhaled, forcing the tension from his shoulders. He could already see where this was going. Paul wouldn't let it drop. And in a small community like theirs, one suspicious neighbor could turn the whole town against you. Back home, Merilith greeted him the moment he opened the door, tugging at his jacket. "Colin, back!" she exclaimed, proud of piecing the phrase together. "Yeah, I'm back," he said with a tired smile, ruffling her hair. Serenia, however, stood behind her sister, eyes narrowed. "People, see?" she asked quietly. Colin hesitated. He wanted to shield them, but lying outright felt wrong. "Yes, one neighbor. He's curious." Asking questions, Serenia exchanged a quick, tense string of words with Merilith. The younger girl's expression faltered, worry creeping into her eyes. "It's fine," Colin said quickly, crouching to meet Merilith's gaze. "You're safe here. I won't let anyone hurt you." Serenia's stare pinned him, skeptical but searching. Finally, she said, "Promise?" The weight of the word made his throat tighten. "Promise." That night, tension pressed heavy in the cabin. Merilith was restless, pacing, while Serenia stood guard by the window as though expecting someone to appear at any moment. Colin tried to keep things normal, supper, fire, quiet conversation, but the unease lingered. When Merilith finally drifted to sleep on the couch, Serenia remained awake, her eyes reflecting the firelight. She broke the silence. "Your people," she said slowly, "do not like different." It wasn't a question. Colin sighed, staring into the flames. "Not always. Some are open, some aren't. Fear makes people do stupid things." Serenia studied him. "Fear make danger, Her words sank like stones in his chest. He couldn't deny it. She was right. Later, when he stepped outside to bring in more firewood, he noticed fresh tire tracks cutting across the snow by the road. Too close to his property to be casual, someone had been watching. He carried the logs inside, forcing a calm face for the girl's sake. But inside, his thoughts churned. Paul was stirring curiosity, and curiosity had a way of growing teeth. And the more the town wondered about the strangers in Colin's cabin, the harder it would be to keep Serenia and Merilith. For 2 days, Colin kept the girls inside. He worked small jobs close to home and brought supplies back, trying to act as though nothing had changed. But Paul's questions lingered like smoke in the air. Every time Colin drove through town, he caught stares, the way conversations hushed when he passed. He knew how quickly whispers could snowball in a community this small. On the third night, as the wind howled against the cabin walls, Serenia broke the silence. She stood near the fire, her face set in quiet determination. "Colin," she said clearly, her voice more confident than before. "We tell." He looked up from the table. "Tell me what?" She gestured to herself, then to Merilith, who was curled up under a blanket, half asleep. "Who we are?" Colin leaned back, arms folded, masking the flicker of nerves. "I've been wondering when you'd get around to that." Serenia took a deep breath, her words slow and deliberate, as though each one carried weight. "We not from here, not this world." Colin felt the floor tilt beneath him. He waited for her to laugh, to correct herself, but her eyes stayed locked on his, serious and unflinching. "Not from here," he repeated, his voice low. She nodded. "We travel, long, far, with others, but..." Left Merilith stirred at the sound of her sister's voice. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, then whispered something quick in their native tongue. Serenia answered softly before continuing in English. "They not want us. We small, weak." Her voice broke for the first time, a sharp edge cutting through her practiced calm. "Thrown away." Colin's chest tightened. The thought of anyone abandoning children, human or not, made his stomach turn. "They just left you?" he asked quietly. Serenia's lips pressed together. She nodded once. Merilith's wide eyes glistened as she whispered, "Snow. Cold." Alone, Colin pushed back from the table and crouched beside them. "Not anymore. You hear me? Not anymore." Serenia studied him, searching for doubt but found none. Her shoulders eased slightly. He asked the question that had gnawed at him since that night. "Are there more like you? Out there?" Serenia hesitated. "Yes, but far. We no go back." She drew a shaky breath. "If they find, they take." The words hung heavy in the room. Colin's mind reeled. If what she said was true, then the danger wasn't just suspicion from the neighbors. It was something much larger, something that might already be looking for them. Still, he couldn't stop himself from asking, "Why me? Why stay with me?" Merilith slipped off the couch and walked straight into his arms, pressing her small frame against him. "Safe," she whispered. Serenia's voice followed, steadier than her sister's. "You stopped. You care. No others." Colin swallowed hard, a mix of pride and fear tangling inside him. He hadn't chosen this, hadn't asked for it, but somewhere between that frozen roadside and this moment by the fire, he'd become the center of their fragile universe. He stayed crouched there, one arm around Merilith, meeting Serenia's gaze. "Then I'll protect you, whatever it takes." For the first time, Serenia's guarded expression cracked. Her lips trembled, and she whispered, "Family?" Colin nodded slowly. "Family." The words seemed to anchor them both. Merilith clung tighter. Serenia lowered herself beside them, her hand resting over his. No more walls, no more hesitation. For the first time, trust filled the space where fear had lived. Yet even as the fire warmed them, Colin's thoughts turned dark. If two girls had been abandoned in the snow, who else might have been left behind? And what would happen if whoever discarded them decided they weren't finished? He didn't voice those fears, not yet. But outside their fragile circle of trust, the world was already closing in, and soon someone else would come looking for answers. The night after Serenia's confession, Colin woke to a sound that didn't belong. Not the groan of ice on the roof, not the trees swaying in the wind. This was sharper, like a low hum of engines passing too slowly overhead. He slipped from bed, grabbed his jacket, and eased open the front door. The air was brittle cold, the sky stretched wide with stars. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then a flash cut across the tree line. Not lightning, not a plane, a steady bluish-white glow that hovered before vanishing as suddenly as it appeared. Colin stood there, breath fogging, heart pounding. The hair on his arms prickled as he realized the hum was gone too. Silence swallowed the forest again. Behind him, a soft voice. "Colin?" He turned to see Serenia in the doorway, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes searched the sky like she already knew what he'd seen. "You heard it too," he whispered. She nodded slowly. Look." "Who's they?" he pressed. She opened her mouth, then closed it. For once, she didn't have the words. Instead, she whispered something to Merilith, who had wandered out, rubbing sleep from her eyes. The younger girl immediately clutched Colin's arm, trembling. He ushered them both inside, closing the door firmly. His pulse hammered in his throat. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't Paul Strickland snooping. Something else was out there. The next day, Colin couldn't shake the tension. He drove into town for groceries, but his eyes stayed glued to the rearview mirror, scanning every car that followed. At the market, people glanced at him longer than usual, whispers following in his wake. Paul was there too, leaning against the counter with that same suspicious glare. "You've been busy," Paul said when Colin passed. "Strange lights last night. Saw 'em myself. Near your property, wasn't it?" Colin forced a scoff. "Probably just the aurora." "Happens all the time this time of year." Paul tilted his head. "Funny. Never seen one hover in place before." His dog barked once, sharp, as if echoing his suspicion. Colin didn't reply. He finished quickly and left, the weight of eyes on his back until he reached the truck. Back at the cabin, Serenia and Merilith were waiting by the window. When he walked in, Merilith rushed to him, blurting in broken English, "See them?" "Not them," he said quickly, "just the neighbor again." Serenia's gaze bore into him. "Not safe," she said firmly. Colin rubbed his hands over his face. "I know, but running won't fix it. We need a plan." That night, he stayed awake by the fire, shotgun propped against the wall. He hadn't touched the thing in years, but tonight it felt necessary. The girls whispered in their strange tongue, voices soft but urgent. Finally, Serenia turned to him. "They come. Not stop. Not give up." Her certainty sent a chill through him colder than the snow outside. He didn't doubt her. Whatever abandoned them wasn't finished. A few hours past midnight, another flash lit the window, closer this time. Merilith gasped and clung to Colin. Serenia stood, fists clenched, defiance written on her face. Colin grabbed the shotgun and eased to the window. Through the trees, a glow pulsed faintly, moving slowly, deliberately, like it was searching. His mouth went dry. This wasn't just light in the sky. It was on the ground, combing the forest. "Get away from the windows," he ordered, voice sharper than he intended. He pulled the curtains closed, heart slamming against his ribs. The glow faded after several minutes, leaving only darkness. But the damage was done. They all knew now. The search had begun in earnest. Colin sat with the shotgun across his lap, Serenia on one side, Merilith on the other. The three of them waited together in silence, listening for footsteps that never came. But Colin understood. If those lights could reach the edge of his woods, it was only a matter of time before they reached his door. The following morning, Colin's nerves were already frayed when he spotted fresh boot prints in the snow outside the cabin bed. They weren't his. They weren't the girls'. Too large, too deliberate, circling close to the porch before heading back toward the road. Whoever it was hadn't bothered to knock. They just watched. Inside, Serenia noticed his rigid stance by the window. "What? Wrong?" she asked, her English now sharper, more precise than even a week ago. Colin turned, jaw tight. Someone was here. Not the lights. A man. Merilith's eyes widened. She rushed to her sister's side, clinging to her arm. Serenia held her, then looked at Colin. "Neighbor?" He nodded grimly. "Yeah, Paul. He doesn't trust me. Doesn't trust you. If he decides to call the sheriff, things will spiral fast." Serenya's face hardened. If they come, we go? Colin shook his head. They'll just chase harder. You run, they'll see you as fugitives. We need something else. Before he could explain further, headlights flared outside. A truck crunched over the icy drive, stopping right at the porch. Colin's guts sank. Paul Strickland. The knock rattled the door. Haverford! Paul's voice cut through the cabin. We need to talk. Serenya and Merilith froze. Colin gestured for them to stay quiet, then opened the door just enough to step outside. Paul stood there with his dog, face red from the cold, eyes sharp. Mind explaining why I've seen shadows in your windows at all hours? And why there were lights in the woods last night? Half the town's buzzing about it. Colin forced calm into his tone. I told you. Family visiting, and those lights, probably hunters with spotlights. Happens every season. Paul narrowed his eyes. Don't play me for a fool. I know what I saw, and I know when someone's hiding something. Colin stepped closer, lowering his voice. Paul, listen. You've known me 20 years. I don't cause trouble. You really think I'd bring it here? Paul hesitated, but suspicion still burned. If there's something dangerous in that house, people deserve to know. If not me, then the sheriff. A flicker of panic clawed at Colin's chest. He pictured Merilith being dragged out, Serenya fighting against uniformed men who would never understand them. He saw the fear in their eyes when they talked about being taken again. Paul, he said quietly, if you trust me at all, let this be. No sheriff, no calls. I'll handle it. Paul studied him for a long beat, then shook his head. You're making a mistake, Haverford. Secrets don't stay buried here. He turned and trudged back to his truck, tires crunching as he drove away. Colin stood there, cold air burning his lungs. When he finally went inside, Serenya was waiting by the door. No? Not everything, Colin admitted. But he's close. Too close, Merilith's voice wavered. They take us? Colin crouched, gripping her shoulders gently. Not if I can stop it. Serenya's eyes locked on his. How? The question sliced through him. How? He wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a politician, he was just an auto electrician with a cabin and a conscience. Yet, somehow these two girls had been dropped into his life, and whether he liked it or not, he was their shield. He took a steadying breath. If it comes down to it, I'll stand in their way. Sheriff, neighbors, whoever shows up, you're not going anywhere without me. Serenya studied him with something close to respect. You choose us. Yeah, Colin said softly. I choose you. The words hung heavy, final. Merilith buried her face against his chest. Serenya placed her hand on his arm, her guarded expression cracking just enough to show the depth of what this meant to her. Colin knew he'd crossed a line. Protecting them wasn't just a promise anymore. It was a choice that would put him against his own people if it came to that. But even as he vowed to shield them, the glow of strange lights returned to the tree line that night, reminding him that the real danger wasn't just human suspicion, but something far more relentless. The lights came back stronger that night. Not fleeting flashes, not distant glimmers. Steady beams, weaving between the trees, sweeping across the snow like spotlights searching for prey. Colin killed the lamps inside the cabin and crouched near the window, shotgun at his side. Serenya stood rigid behind him. Merilith pressed to her arm, both of them whispering urgently in their own tongue. Colin, Serenya said finally, her voice low but sharp. They hear. His throat was dry. I see them. Through the glass, he caught silhouettes moving between the trees. They weren't townsfolk. He knew that instantly. The figures moved too smooth, too precise, their outlines blurred by the glow that seemed to follow them. He didn't need Serenya's confirmation to know these were the same ones who had abandoned the girls. Now they had come back. Merilith clutched his sleeve. Don't take us, she whispered, her eyes wide and pleading. Colin turned, gripping her hand tightly. I won't. Not while I'm breathing." The light swept closer. He could hear the faint hum again, vibrating through the ground, rattling the cabin's old windows. Serenia stepped to his side, her jaw set. "We fight?" she asked, testing the word like she was weighing its meaning. Colin looked at her, really looked. This wasn't just about hiding anymore. This was about standing between them and a fate they clearly feared more than death. "Yeah," he said, steady now. "We fight." He opened the door and stepped onto the porch, the cold cutting like knives. The lights froze, converging toward him. His voice carried across the frozen yard. "You're not taking them!" For a heartbeat, silence. Then one of the glowing figures stepped forward. Its shape was almost human but taller, its face hidden by the glare. It raised an arm, and the hum deepened. Serenia appeared beside Colin, holding nothing but standing tall. "Family," she shouted into the night, her accent thick but her meaning clear. "No take. Family." The figure paused. The lights flickered, dimmed, then steadied again. Colin raised the shotgun, finger tight on the trigger, but his voice was iron. "They're mine now. You threw them away. They belong here." The standoff stretched. Then, without warning, the lights flickered again, once, twice, and retreated. The figures melted back into the trees, glow fading until the forest swallowed them whole. The hum cut off, leaving only the sharp snap of winter air. Colin lowered the gun slowly, his chest heaving. Serenia's shoulders slumped in relief, though her eyes still searched the tree line as if expecting their return. Merilith ran forward, wrapping her arms around Colin's waist, sobbing into his jacket. "They go?" she whispered. "For now," he answered, voice rough. "But if they come back, we'll be ready." Inside, the three of them sat by the fire, exhaustion heavy but spirits unbroken. Serenia studied him with something new in her gaze. Not just gratitude, but recognition. "You risk all," she said softly. Colin nodded. "That's what family does. We don't turn our backs. We don't throw each other away." Merilith nestled against him, already half asleep, safe in the glow of the fire. Serenia sat straighter, her expression still protective, but softer than ever before. "We stay," she said simply. "With you. Family." Colin stared into the flames, letting the words settle in his chest. Family. A bond born not of blood but of choice, forged in snow, fear, and firelight. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't be safe, but it was real. The storm outside passed quietly that night, leaving only the creak of the cabin and the steady breathing of the two girls who had once been strangers. And as Colin drifted toward sleep, one truth remained carved into him. Sometimes family isn't who you're given, it's who you fight to keep. If this story touched you, remember this. Kindness might look small in the moment, but it can change someone's entire world. Don't be afraid to be that anchor for someone else. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what's next.